Hi, this is Salahuddin with lecture number 24. In the previous lecture, we talked about the mercantile system, which remain the guiding principle for the 18th century wars. We have discussed the mercantile system in detail, and today we will talk about the George III, George III's reign and his reforms and the effects of George III's reign on the Great Britain. We will talk about all those important points. So coming to the uh, topic, George III tried to establish personal rule. Personal rule was really amounted to the rules that uh, were followed prior to George I and George II earlier when the when the Glorious Revolution did not take place. So that kind of personal rule was tried by George III. However, George III had signed the Bill of Rights and the Act of Settlement that he will not interfere in the parliament, he will not compromise those principles and rules which had been defined in those clauses of Act of Settlement and Bill of Rights. So coming to George III's reign, whose reign started from 1760 to 1870. Uh, in introduction, we can see on the day of succession, George III, who was the son of Frederick the King, came on the throne of England. On the very first day, he said, "I glory in the name of Britain," which means I'm the real king and the ministers must obey me. So he was completely English in his feelings, thinking, and features, and he was greatly loved by people. Prior to George III, George I and George II, they were ignorant of the English language, the English customs, and the English values. Therefore, they remained puppets in the hands of the ministers or in the hands of prime minister. While George III was completely English, he was born and brought up in England. While George I and George II, they were born and brought up in the Hanover, which was at that time a state in the Germany. While George III was uh, born here in England, so he could understand the English language, the English customs, the values, and he was in a sense completely English man. uh, he was not that kind of lavish characters where his ancestors or father and forefathers were. They were lavish in character, while Jatri was very simple and sublime characters. So coming to the point, favorable circumstances for establishing personal rule. What were those circumstances that led to the establishment of the personal rule of George III? So we will talk about all those important circumstances which helped George III to establish his personal rule. As I talked to you in detail that what kind of personal rule, what does it mean by personal rule? By personal rule, George III means that I must be a real king. Unlike his forefathers, George I and George II, they would not take interest in the English politics because they were ignorant of the English language. They could not understand the English language, what their ministers are talking in the meeting, what they are discussing. So they could not take interest in the English politics, and even they were ignorant of the English values and customs. So now when George III came on succession, came to the throne, he said that I must be the real king because I can understand the English customs and I do understand the English language. So the kings that prior to George III were uh, puppets in the hands of the ministers and prime minister. Now that rule should be wiped out now. So coming to the point, the circumstances for establishing personal rule, the first important point is well acquainted with the politics and system of government of England. George III was well acquainted with politics and system of government because he was born in England. He could understand the English language and he could also understand the English values, customs, and uh, the traditions. Therefore, he was well acquainted with the English politics and system of government of England. So this is the first point that helped in establishing the personal rule. Second important point is influence of his mother and his teacher Bolingbroke. His mother, who would always tell him, George III, be a real king. George III, be a real king. His mother, right from the very start or from the very young age, would tell him that George III, you must be a real king. By a real king, she means you must be obeyed by your ministers. You must be the choosing authority of choosing ministers in the cabinet. So this influence on George III by his mother helped in establishing the personal rule. Second important point in establishing personal rule was uh, characters of George III. The characters of George III was of a very sublime nature. He was greatly loved by people. He had a kind of charming way of speech, and he would often discuss the problems, the matters with the common people. And he was himself a farmer, and he had a farmhouse in the rural areas where he would visit most often, and there he would discuss the farming techniques with the farmers. And because of that, people out of love called him Farmer the George. Uh, Fourth important point was the cooperation with people. Uh, People think that king should be obeyed by his ministers, and people also think that the king should be a real king. He should have the power of choosing ministers. He should have the power of administering administrations, and he should be an all in all in power. Thus, this cooperation or this view of the people helped him in establishing his personal rule. Uh, Fifth important point is differences in the Whig Party. As we talked in detail, that the Whig Party was the party of the middle class people and the industrialists. So they were quite well off in that sense. Uh, when while Walpole during his tenure was the prime minister, whose prime ministership started from the 1721 to 1741 or 42 when he died. Uh, Walpole is the first prime minister in the history of the England. When he was prime minister, he would dismiss any member of his party who could not uh, agree with him in his policies. In this regard, he dismissed some very great leaders of the Whig Party, which led to the differences in the Whig Party. Resultantly, the George greatly benefited from those differences and utilized those differences and making himself the real king. Uh, when Walpole turned ministers, so few are mentioned here who were turned by Walpole, like Townshend, Pilteny, Carteret, and Chattersfield. They were dismissed for the reasons that they were not in agreement or in consensus with the Walpole. Uh, Sixth important point is Tories favored the king. The Tories that we have started in the that we have talked in the previous lecture. The Tories, they were conservative in nature. They were against reforms. They were staunch Catholics. So they were also in favor of the divine right of kingship. So establishing personal rule was in a kind of where George III had developed a natural inclination towards Tory, because the Tories were also favoring such personal rule, like prior to the Glorious Revolution, where James II and Charles I and Charles II had. So this the favor of Tories party helped George III in establishing his personal rule. Uh, the seventh important point was meager cabinet system. By meager cabinet system, George III means that this cabinet was developed as a result of the incompetency, ignorance of his forefathers. How? Like his forefathers, George II and George I, they were completely ignorant of the English politics, even the English language. They could not take interest in the English politics. They could not attend the meetings. Therefore, they had no soft corner for the English politics and even for England. Thus, this cabinet is devolved as a result of the incompetency of George I and George II. So now this meager cabinet system or this cabinet should whiffed out because it was devolved circumstantial or accidental. Uh, the eighth important point is use of patronage power. When Whig was in power, they would use this power of bribery, titles, unjust distributions, right? All these evils were norm of the day at the time when the Whig Party was ruling. So when George III came in power, he also started utilizing this patron and taking people on his own side with the help of patronages, like giving them titles, giving them bribes, right? And sometimes unjust distributions of resources, which led him to the establishment of the personal rule of George III, as well as those peoples started favoring George III also. So the use of patronage power also helped in establishing of the George III's personal rule. Then they finally Bolingbroke's influence. Bolingbroke, as we stated in the start of the lecture, that he was teacher of George III. And in the later part of the lecture, we will also talk about that The Bolingbroke had also a very close relationship with his mother, and we will talk about in detail that why he was dismissed later on. In the second part of the lecture, we will talk about Bolingbroke's character and his relationship with the mother of George III. But now he was greatly influenced by uh, Bolingbroke. George III was greatly influenced by Bolingbroke, and he wrote a book on the idea of a patriotic king. In this book, which was read by George III and influenced George III also, and he wrote in this book that the king should be a real king. He should not be a king in name like those of, unlike the forefather or the forefather of George III's. And the king should be above politics, and he should be obeyed by his ministers. So all these factors, circumstances led to the establishment of personal rule of George III. And the second part of of this lecture, we will talk about the effects of George III's personal rule on Great Britain. So thank you so much for watching the video.